Depending on what equipment is available and how the principal can get it, the principal may get what he needs before deploying. Most of the principal's equipment should support his cover, as the first weeks in country are when the adversary and locals scrutinize the principal the most. After circumstances return to normal, the principal may get the rest of the equipment he needs to complete his goals. A key part of preparation is getting visas for the regions in which he works and to where he would escape. This is something he cannot neglect and ensures are current. The Ratline chapter further discusses this. At this point, the principal knows where he should lay his head at night and how he will get around. The principal decides whether to make reservations before entering the area or use shopping as a reason for counter-surveillance. Either way, not choosing the best locations or vehicles gives the principal a reason for change if the operation or security calls for it. The next section discusses those preparatory steps the principal does after deploying to the target area. The next phase of an operation is execution. In this phase, the principal deploys to the target area, sets up the support infrastructure and relationships, completes his goals, and returns home alive. The principal made his way to the target area. He packed his bags, boarded the plane or boat, and set foot inside the target area. The principal is now in a state of uncertainty. For the first few weeks in the target area, the principal assumes everyone scrutinizes him and all that he does. Therefore, the principal must not perform any compromising activities during this period. This period ends when the principal confidently decides others no longer scrutinize him. During this time, the principal limits himself to only those activities that are not compromising, which include casing, spotting for residents, backstopping and seasoning his cover, and establishing natural patterns. Casing is deciding whether a location is suitable for operational use. Casing results in the principal's abilities to predict whether the location is conducive to conduct some operational activity. At this point, the principal knows what types of locations he needs for operational functions. The principal gathers enough data and information about these locations to confidently predict whether that location is suitable at the proposed time of using it. There are two phases to casing: map reconnaissance and personal reconnaissance. Map reconnaissance is searching areas of interest via records and documents to add or remove potentially suitable locations. This is not only using maps, as the term implies, but includes other open sources to understand more about those locations and the areas that surround them. However, map reconnaissance is never enough. Personal reconnaissance is uncompromisingly necessary. Many believe that a good Google recon is enough, when in fact it is far from it. Personal reconnaissance is necessary for two reasons. Even the more current documents and records may not be current enough, such as in the case for web-based mapping applications, and the authors of those records and documents did not create them by casing for clandestine activities. A couple of examples include how buildings change businesses, like from a store to a bank, or how proprietors of these locations add certain security measures like cameras or guards. The principal assesses operational locations by applying the exposure and logic principles. Exposure is physical in nature, while logic is psychological in nature. Exposure relates to how a subject must stimulate the observer's senses to acknowledge the subject's existence. There are two ways to affect exposure: physical obstruction and duration of observability. In terms of security, duration depends on obstruction. The more obstruction, the more time available for contact. Logic is whether the subject will stay in the observer's memory once he sees and acknowledges the subject. An observer often disregards or forgets an ordinary subject quickly. However, an observer remembers and may discuss rare, bizarre, or troubling occurrence. Just as duration is to obstruction, so is logic to exposure. The more exposure to an observer, the more the contact needs logic in appearance and behavior. While casing may start in this phase, the principal will case throughout the duration of the operation. Each chapter discusses its own casing considerations. Spotting is searching for people who could successfully perform some task or function necessary for the operation. After the principal decides with what he needs help, spotting is the step that builds a list of such candidates. The next step is assessment, which this section discusses later. Making a list of potential residents derives from the intelligence gathered about a target or understanding the context of an operational goal. The more the principal discovers about a target through OSINT, direct observations, and eventually HUMINT, the more he will notice people who can help him succeed in his goals. For example, if a journalist discovers his target frequents a certain restaurant to discuss sensitive topics, then the principal would spot for staff who may overhear conversations of interest. Seasoning a cover is using it by living and wearing it. Depending on the circumstances, the principal may need to do some backstopping, which is creating and putting into place evidence that supports his cover. The principal tries to do as much of the backstopping as he can before deployment, but there may be some elements to the cover that he can only backstop after. He seasons and backstops while he's deciding whether he is still under scrutiny. Lastly, the principal sets up his natural patterns, which are the locations, schedules, and activities he wishes others will come to expect from him. The principal incorporates casing, spotting, and cover seasoning to help build his natural patterns so those areas, times, and behaviors do not raise suspicions later. The covers chapter discusses this more. Once the principal decides his natural patterns are well established, where people no longer take interest in his presence or activities, he starts setting up his support infrastructure. The support infrastructure includes those relationships, sites, caches, and route lines that will ensure the principal can complete his operation and make it home alive. These activities are not completely clandestine, but, if discovered, would lead to the adversary to investigate the principal. These activities include approaching and assessing support residents, caching, equipment acquisition, and setting up route lines. At this point, the principal only approaches and assesses support residents. Prematurely approaching an operational resident before the principal establishes the support infrastructure may put the principal in a situation he cannot escape. The principal must separate residents and support roles from operational roles. Support residents should not be in any way involved with, nor have a reason to hide from the adversary. The principal must not try to reuse operational residents for support tasks. Support roles are separate from operational roles and must stay that way for security, also known as compartmentalization. The beginning of any relationship with a resident is the initial pretext, which is the circumstances of how the principal and the resident first meet. There's much that goes into this step, first being a preliminary investigation. Once the principal has a list of residents, he starts an investigation for each one to decide which residents offer the greatest chance of success to complete the proposed task or function. These investigations follow a principle known as least to most intrusive. It starts with methods which offer the least interference and risk, and progresses to methods which are more sensitive or aggressive. First, the principal will try to gather information about a resident through OSINT, like licenses, social media, and so on. When the principal may include surveillance, eliciting from associates, and dumpster diving to get a better understanding of who the target is. The last phase is often approaching the target directly, such as elicitation. As the principal gathers more information about a resident, he assesses them and decides whether they would be good candidates for recruitment. If the principal discovers something about the resident that makes him unsuitable, the principal stops the investigation and moves on to another candidate. If the principal decides a resident is worth approaching, he must select a proper pretext to approach him. The goal of this initial pretext is to put the principal and resident into a situation where a relationship will blossom. This may not be a one-time effort, as the principal may choose to increment his presence into the resident's life over time. Depending on the type of operation, the resident may soon discover that the principal thinks, acts, and believes the same as the resident does. The resident discovers a new best friend. When the principal assesses a resident, he keeps 3 questions in mind. Would, could, and should the resident do what the principal asks? Would. This is by far the most crucial factor in clandestine operations. Often is a matter of finding people who are willing to do something, as a principal can often teach or fabricate the other factors of capability and suitability. Approaching the wrong person can often expose the principal to hostilities well beyond any other factor, so it is important that he pays attention to a potential resident's motivations before and after recruitment. The principal may find many who could, but only a few actually would. There are several approaches to understanding the psychological motivations of someone who is willing to face adversity for someone else. There are the money, ideology, compassion, and ego MICE model, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs model, and the reciprocation, authority, scarcity, commitment, consistency, liking, social proof, RASCCLS model. Regardless of the model, there are three component needs which alleviate internal conflict. They are psychological, material, and emotional. If one or more of these needs conflict with the others, then it becomes difficult to predict the resident's behavior. Psychological needs often grant purpose. The resident must be psychologically in tune with what the principal is trying to do. While the principal can buy allegiances, that is often superficial and unreliable. The moment the resident faces adversity, he leaves. There is little point of earning money if one cannot spend it. The principal wants someone who believes with their logical faculty that what he is doing is just and right. Material needs are how people live. This is often manifested as money, as that is how people obtain food, shelter, clothes, luxuries, and vices. If what the principal asks of the resident becomes a burden on the resident financially or materialistically to the point of sacrifice, it will become an unbearable stress. There is a balance when it comes to supplying material needs. Too much and people tend to get greedy or lazy. Too little and people feel taken advantage of. The principal seeks to meet the resident's perceived needs and then some extra to allow for a bit of luxury, but nothing too extravagant from his current personal circumstance. This will also lead to setting up an emotional bond. Emotional needs are something that people must feel to own loyalty. Even if the resident believes in the same ideologies and has his material needs met, unless the resident has a personal, heartfelt tie, then adversity will shatter the relationship. Emotional needs or compassion is often the result of reciprocity, liking, commitment, or similar. Helping another in a time of need or lifting a burden makes comrades. If the principal can be that personal savior, then he will have a reliable, loyal friend, at least until the principal becomes a burden and the resident repays the debt. Could. This is purely about the ability to successfully do what the principal asks. The resident must own the necessary knowledge, skills, abilities, and equipment to succeed. Not only basic skills, but further skills to overcome expected obstacles in the real mission. When it comes to whether someone could perform the required task, the resident must own the intestinal fortitude to execute what the principal needs him to under the mission's specific circumstances. Some people are willing and seem to be a perfect candidate. However, when the going gets tough, some people just cannot perform. The principal must devise a test to figure out how the resident would handle the stress he would face during the mission. Should has two considerations: reliability and morals. While could decides whether a mission success is plausible, should decides whether it is probable. Reliability is the determining factor of probability and has many considerations, including personal circumstances, plans and goals, and discipline. Personal circumstances involve obligations to one's family, work, and society. The principal should assess the priority of these circumstances in comparison to what the principal needs the resident to do and when the resident must do it. If under no circumstances will the resident sacrifice his weekends with his children, then the task or function should either avoid that sacred time or the principal find someone who is more suitable. plans and goals. Many often overlook them. The principal needs to know if the resident will be around when needed. The principal ensures the resident is not moving or selling needed equipment before a task or function is performed. The principal desires reliability, and if he must recruit a replacement, then he should do so in a way that minimizes the lack of coverage as much as possible. Discipline is paramount. The resident must perform to a standard regardless of how he feels at the time. This is important in facing adversity, but also in how the resident approaches life. Many people who are incredibly gifted still lack discipline and drive to get them where they need to be. If the resident is perpetually late, lacks in his assessments or performance, then he has discipline issues. Morals, the other half of should, discusses the morals of recruiting the resident. This ranges from the resident's demographics to the repercussions of what may happen if the adversary catches the resident. The principal answer whether he could live with himself knowing that the resident understood full well and accepted the risks. The principal must not do anything he will later regret, like recruit a child or ask someone to unwittingly accept the risks of torture or homicide. The last step in acquiring a resident is recruitment. This is outside the scope of this book. There are many other publications that cover this, even in the context of clandestine relationships. The last steps of setting up support infrastructure are caching and setting up rat lines. The respective chapters discuss these in much detail. After the principal establishes support infrastructure, he moves on to operational goals. Even though it seems like there was much work performed up to this point, the principal is less than or equal to 50% done with his operation, depending on his goals. This next part of the operation includes assessing, approaching, and recruiting operational residents and completing the develop, task, train, deploy, recover, exploit cycle several times until the principal meets his goals or exhausts his resources. To make a long explanation shorter, the principal must apply the same level of assessment, development, and training he did for himself to the resident. The principal is responsible for the success of the operation, which means he's also responsible for the success of each resident. Once the operation accomplishes its goal, the principal must conclude his activities. This includes ending the relationships, dissolving or liquidating the assets, and making his way out of the target area. Depending on operational goals, the principal may set up redundant resident operations to ensure success. If one or a few resident operations accomplish the goals before the others, the principal needs to shut the others down, even if incomplete. Terminating a relationship is outside the scope of this book. However, it is important to note that the principal satisfied his promises to his residents and reiterates the importance of secrecy and finality of the relationship. After the principal concludes his relationships, he must close his cover life in a smooth and natural manner. The principal can either build in a limit to the cover, like an expiring visa or contract, or he can have another catalyst that gives him a graceful exit. For those covers that acquired assets throughout the operation, like a business, vehicle, residence, and so on, the principal liquidates those assets or agreements. Doing this may keep the adversary from becoming suspicious. Even if the principal leaves the target area, it does not mean all his associates are safe. After the closure, the principal boards a plane or boat and goes home. The previous section described how an operation would flow if everything followed the plan. However, humans make mistakes. If there were no threats from an adversary, then this book would be unnecessary. Whether the principal, a resident, or bad luck leads to compromise, the principal needs to plan for it. Adversarial awareness is a concept that relates to the risk of discovery. There are 3 awareness phases through which the adversary may transition during an operation: ignorance, probing, and targeting. Ignorant is the complete unawareness of clandestine activities. This is where the principal works successfully. He cases, caches, meets, and facilitates his operation. Tradecraft tries to keep the adversary in this phase with the use of natural patterns, covers, and communication techniques. Probing is a preliminary investigation to decide whether a claim of clandestine activities has merit. If a claim does have merit, the adversary moves on to the targeting phase. Otherwise, they may move back to the ignorance phase. craft seeks to detect this phase shift and protects the operation from more intrusive scrutiny. The principal does this through counter-surveillance, caching, and covers. If the principal detects any form of surveillance, he aborts any further clandestine action, resorts to his cover, and eventually makes his way out of the adversary's jurisdiction. Targeting is after probing, and the adversary decides the claim of clandestine activities has merit. The adversary is now seeking through evidence to persecute the principal and all his associated residents. If the adversary reaches this phase, the principal neither detected nor protected against the probing phase. Any continued presence in the area is extremely dangerous. Tradecraft tries to circumvent this hostile situation with a rat line. While least to most intrusive is a general investigative principle, the adversary may not follow it. Adversaries may conduct a couple of interviews, burglarize a residence or work, or jump straight to interrogation. The adversary's resources, morals, and professionalism decide their process of investigation. Many Western governments have an abundance of resources, their citizenry holds their agencies accountable, and are very competent and professional. These governments may progress through many phases of investigation and spend gratuitous amounts of money to collect the necessary evidence. Contrast this with militant extremists or criminal organizations who murder suspects based on emotion, pomp, biased testimony, or uncorroborated or circumstantial evidence. The principal is wise to set up an early warning system which notifies the principal of any imminence of hostility. Sources of this information include all recruited residents, direct observations, and OSINT. OSINT sources include radio, television, newspaper, and embassy alerts. The goal is getting information about impending threat before hostiles put the principal in any situation he cannot escape.